The Little House by the Lake. Episode 2. The Footprints. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. For a few seconds, he lay in bed without moving. He looked at the ceiling. Then he remembered everything. The boat, the man, the bell, Samuel, and the footprints outside his back door. Daniel slowly sat up. The house was quiet, very quiet. He listened. Nothing. No knocking. No bell. No footsteps. Only the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees. Daniel got out of bed and walked toward the kitchen. He stopped before opening the back door. He looked through the window. The morning sun was shining over the lake. Everything looked normal. The lake was calm. The trees were green. A few birds were flying above the water. Daniel took a deep breath. Maybe it was a dream, he whispered, but he knew it wasn't. He opened the door. Cold morning air entered the kitchen. Daniel stepped outside. He immediately looked down. The footprints were still there. They began at the edge of the lake. Then they continued across the wet grass. One step, then another, and another. They stopped directly in front of his back door. Daniel stared at them. He didn't move. The footprints were large. They looked like the footprints of a man. Daniel followed them with his eyes. There were no footprints going back toward the lake, only footprints coming from the water. Daniel felt uncomfortable. He looked toward the lake. The old wooden boat was gone. The rope that had held it to the tree was still there, but the boat had disappeared. Daniel walked slowly toward the water. He looked left, then right. Nothing. The lake stretched peacefully in front of him. He wondered if the boat had somehow floated away during the night, but the rope was still tied tightly around the tree. Daniel bent down and touched it. The rope was wet, very wet. He stood up. "Okay," he said quietly. "That's strange." A voice behind him made him jump. "You're awake early." Daniel turned around. Samuel was standing near the road. He was holding his fishing pole. Daniel looked at him. "Samuel." Samuel walked closer. "You saw them." It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "The footprints?" Samuel nodded. Daniel pointed toward the lake. "The boat is gone." Samuel looked at the empty space beside the tree. His face became serious. "I know." Daniel stared at him. "You know?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the water. He looked at the rope. Then he looked across the lake. "Come with me." "Where?" "To my house?" Daniel hesitated. "Why?" "Because there are things you need to know." Daniel looked back at the lake. Then he followed Samuel. They walked along a narrow road beside the lake. The road was quiet. There were only a few houses in the area. After about 10 minutes, they arrived at a small gray house. Samuel opened the door. "Come in." Daniel stepped inside. The house smelled like coffee and old wood. There were fishing pictures on the walls, photographs of boats, photographs of the lake, and photographs of people. Samuel walked into the kitchen. "Coffee?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, please." Samuel made 2 cups. They sat at a small table near the window. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel asked, "Who is the man who disappeared?" Samuel looked down at his coffee. "His name was Thomas." "Thomas?" "Thomas Miller." "Did he own my house?" "Yes." Daniel leaned forward. "What happened to him?" Samuel took a slow breath. "Thomas moved into that house when he was about 40 years old." "When?" "About 30 years ago." Daniel looked confused. "But you said he disappeared 20 years ago." "That's right." Samuel looked toward the window. "Thomas lived there for about 10 years before he disappeared." "Was he married?" "No." "Did he have family?" "Not nearby." Daniel waited. Samuel continued. Thomas was a quiet man. He didn't talk much. He liked the lake. He spent most of his time fishing. Like you? Samuel smiled. Maybe a little like me. Then his smile disappeared. But Thomas became obsessed with the bell. Daniel looked at him. The bell? Samuel nodded. He heard it one night. Just like me? Yes. What did he do? He tried to find it. Daniel was quiet. Did he find the boat? Yes. Then what happened? Samuel looked directly at Daniel. He started hearing the bell every night. Daniel felt a chill. Every night? Almost every night. Samuel took another drink of coffee. At first, he thought it was another fisherman. Then he thought someone was playing a joke on him. But eventually, he started seeing the boat. Daniel remembered the boat from the night before. What did it look like? An old wooden rowboat. Just like the one I saw? Samuel nodded. But there was something different. What? The boat never made a sound. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? No matter how fast it moved, there was no sound from the oars. Samuel paused. And there was always a man inside. Could Thomas see his face? No. Why? Because the man always sat in the shadows. Daniel looked toward the window. What happened to Thomas? Samuel was silent for a long time. One night, Thomas followed the boat. Daniel swallowed. He crossed the lake? Yes. Did he come back? Samuel shook his head. Never. Did the police search for him? For weeks. Did they find anything? His boat. Where? On the other side of the lake. Daniel felt a cold feeling in his stomach. Was Thomas's body ever found? No. Samuel looked down. Nothing was ever found. Daniel didn't know what to say. Finally, he asked, And people still hear the bell? Samuel nodded. Some people hear it once, and others? Some hear it many times. Daniel looked at him. Why? Samuel gave a small shrug. Nobody knows. The kitchen became quiet again. Daniel finished his coffee. Then he asked, Why did you tell me not to answer the bell? Samuel looked at him. Because Thomas made that mistake. What did he do? He rang it? Daniel remembered the man in the boat. The man in the boat? Samuel nodded. Thomas rang the bell back. Daniel felt a chill move through his body. And then? The boat came to him. Daniel looked at Samuel. Are you saying the boat came to his house? Yes. And then Thomas disappeared? That same night. Daniel stood up. I need to go home. Samuel nodded. I understand. They walked outside together. Before Daniel left, Samuel stopped him. There is one more thing. Daniel turned around. What? If you hear the bell again tonight, Samuel looked directly into his eyes. Do not ring it. Daniel nodded. I won't. And don't go near the lake. I won't. Samuel put his hands into his jacket pockets. Good. Daniel started walking away. Then Samuel called his name. Daniel. Daniel turned around. Yes? Samuel's voice was quiet. If you hear someone calling your name from the lake, he paused. Don't answer. Daniel stared at him. Why? Samuel looked toward the water. Because it may not be a person. Daniel didn't ask any more questions. He walked home. The rest of the day passed slowly. Daniel tried to keep himself busy. He cleaned the house. He unpacked more boxes. He went to the grocery store. He even spent an hour reading a book. But he couldn't stop thinking about Samuel's story, Thomas, the bell, the boat, the missing man. Every time Daniel looked toward the lake, he felt uneasy. Around 5 o'clock, Daniel went outside. The sun was still high enough to light the trees. The lake looked peaceful, almost beautiful. It was hard to believe that anything strange could happen there. Daniel walked down to the water. He stopped several feet from the shore. The old rope was still tied to the tree. He looked at it. Then he looked across the lake. Nothing. Daniel took a deep breath. "There's always a simple explanation," he said. He smiled. But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. That evening, Daniel ate dinner early. He made pasta and sat at the kitchen table. He turned on the television. The room filled with voices. Normally, that would have been comforting. But tonight, Daniel didn't want to hear voices. He turned the television off. The house became silent. Daniel looked at the clock, 8:30. He still had several hours before bedtime. He decided to take a shower. After his shower, he changed into comfortable clothes. Then he made some tea. He sat on the couch and opened his book. He read for a while. Everything was normal. Everything was quiet. At 9:15, Daniel heard a noise outside. He looked up. A branch had fallen. He laughed at himself. "You need to relax," he said. He continued reading. At 9:35, he heard another sound. Scrape. Daniel stopped. He listened. Scrape. It sounded like something moving across the wooden porch. Daniel slowly put down his book. He looked toward the back door. Nothing. He stood up. He walked closer. He looked through the window. The porch was empty. Daniel opened the door. Cold air entered the room. He looked around. Nothing. He stepped onto the porch. The moon was shining over the lake. The water was still. Daniel looked down. There were no footprints. He smiled. "See?" He turned around, and then he heard it. Ding! Daniel froze. The bell. He looked toward the lake. There was nothing there. Ding! The sound came again. Daniel took one step backward. Not tonight. Ding! He closed his eyes. He remembered Samuel's warning. Do not answer. Do not go near the lake. Daniel went back inside. He closed the door. He locked it. Then he closed the curtains. He walked into the living room. Then he closed the curtains. He walked into the living room. He sat on the couch. He picked up his book, but he didn't read. He simply held it. Ding! The bell sounded again. This time, it seemed to come from inside the house. Daniel looked around. His heart began to beat faster. Ding! He stood up. Where is that coming from? Silence. Then, ding! Daniel looked toward the hallway. The sound was coming from the bedroom. Slowly, he walked down the hallway. The bedroom door was open. The room was dark. Daniel turned on the light. Nothing. The bell sounded again. Ding! Daniel looked around. Then he noticed something on the floor. A small wooden box. It hadn't been there before. Daniel stared at it. He was certain. He had cleaned the room earlier. The box had not been there. He slowly walked toward it. It was old, very old. There was a small metal lock on the front. Daniel picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. He turned it over. On the bottom, there were 3 letters carved into the wood. T.M. Daniel's heart stopped for a moment. Thomas Miller. The box belonged to Thomas. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. He stared at the box. How had it gotten there? Where had it come from? He looked around the room. Then he noticed something else. There was a loose piece of wood on the floor. Daniel moved it. Underneath it was a small metal key. He picked up the key. He looked at the box, then back at the key. He knew he shouldn't open it. Samuel had warned him. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Daniel put the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. He turned it. Click. The box opened. Inside were several old photographs, a notebook, and a small brass bell. Daniel stared at the bell. It looked exactly like the bell he had seen on the boat. His hands began to shake. He picked up the notebook. The first page had a name written on it, Thomas Miller. Under the name was a date, June 14th. Daniel turned the page. There was a sentence. He read it slowly. The bell started again tonight. Daniel turned the page. The sound came from the lake. Another page. I found the boat. Another. It is not an ordinary boat. Daniel continued reading. I saw the man again. Another page. He knows my name. Daniel stopped. He looked up. The room suddenly felt cold. He continued. Tonight he called me from the water. Daniel's heart was beating faster. He turned the page. I heard my name. Another page. I almost answered. Another. Samuel told me not to follow the boat. Daniel stopped reading. Samuel knew. He knew about Thomas. He knew what had happened. Daniel turned another page. I cannot stop thinking about the boat. Another. I believe it wants me to cross the lake. Another. Tonight I will go. Daniel closed the notebook. He sat very still. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe normally. Then he heard something. Ding. Daniel looked at the small brass bell in his hand. It had moved. He dropped it onto the bed. Ding. The bell rang again. Daniel stood up. He looked toward the window. The curtains were closed. He didn't want to open them, but something made him walk toward them. Slowly, he pulled the curtain back. The lake was dark, and there was a boat. It was floating directly in front of the house. Daniel stared at it. The same old wooden boat, the same dark figure. The man was sitting inside. He was looking toward the house. Daniel stepped away from the window. The man slowly stood up. Then he raised one hand. Daniel watched. The man pointed toward the house. Then he pointed toward the lake. Then he rang the bell. Ding! Daniel closed the curtain. He backed away. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the bell. Then he heard a voice, very quietly, from outside. Daniel! He froze. The voice came again. Daniel! It sounded like a man's voice. Daniel didn't move. Daniel! The voice was closer now. He could hear it near the back door. Daniel remembered Samuel's warning. If you hear someone calling your name from the lake, don't answer. Daniel remained silent. The voice called again. Daniel! Then it changed. It sounded different. It sounded like someone he knew. Daniel's heart began to race. Daniel! This time, it sounded like his mother. Daniel closed his eyes. His mother had been gone for many years. He knew it couldn't be her, but the voice sounded exactly like her. Warm, gentle, familiar. Daniel, open the door. A tear appeared in Daniel's eye. He wanted to answer. He wanted to hear her voice again, but he knew something was wrong. He stepped away from the door. The voice became louder. Daniel, he covered his ears. Go away. He immediately stopped. He had spoken. He had answered. Silence. Daniel stood frozen. Then he heard 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The voice spoke again. But now it was no longer his mother's voice. It was an old man's voice. Daniel. Daniel recognized it. Thomas, the missing owner of the house. Help me. Daniel stared at the door. The voice continued. I'm still here. Daniel didn't move. Please. Daniel looked at the notebook. Then he looked at the brass bell. Suddenly, the bell began to move by itself. Ding, ding, ding. Daniel stepped backward. The bedroom light flickered. Once, twice. Then it went out. The entire house became dark. Daniel stood in the darkness. He could hear the wind outside. Then he heard something else. Water. Dripping water. Inside the house. Daniel turned on his phone flashlight. He slowly looked around. There was water on the floor. A trail of wet footprints began in the hallway. Daniel stared at them, one footprint, then another, then another. The footprints were coming toward him. Daniel backed away. The footprints stopped. Right in front of the bedroom door. Daniel couldn't move. Then a shadow appeared on the wall. A tall shadow. It looked like a man. Daniel slowly turned around. There was nobody there, but the shadow remained. It moved, slowly, toward him. Daniel dropped the phone. The light went across the floor. The shadow disappeared. Then, ding! The brass bell was gone. Daniel looked at the bed. The box was still there. The notebook was still there. But the bell had disappeared. Daniel picked up his phone. He ran out of the bedroom. He ran into the living room. He opened the front door. Cold air hit his face. He ran outside. The moon was bright above the lake. The boat was gone. The man was gone. Everything was gone. Daniel stood outside, breathing heavily. Then he saw something. Across the lake, a light, one small light. It moved slowly between the trees. Daniel watched it. The light stopped. Then another light appeared, and another, and another. Soon there were several lights moving along the opposite shore. Daniel didn't understand. What were they? Who was carrying them? Then he heard a sound. Ding! Daniel looked down. The small brass bell was sitting on the ground beside his feet. He stepped backward. He didn't touch it. He didn't move. He simply stared at it. Then the bell rang again. Ding! From across the lake, one of the lights suddenly moved toward him. It was coming closer, very quickly. Daniel turned toward the house. He wanted to run inside, but before he could move, he heard a voice behind him. Daniel! He slowly turned around. Samuel was standing at the edge of the road. His face was pale. He looked frightened. Samuel? Samuel walked quickly toward him. Where did you get that? Daniel pointed at the bell. It appeared here. Samuel stared at it. Don't touch it. I didn't. Samuel looked toward the lake. Then he looked back at Daniel. You opened the box, didn't you? Daniel nodded. Samuel closed his eyes. Oh no. What? You should never have opened it. Daniel looked at him. What was in the box? Samuel looked toward the lake again. Thomas's last journal. Daniel nodded. I read it. Then you know. I know that he heard the bell. Samuel shook his head. No. Daniel frowned. What? You don't know the most important part. Samuel stepped closer. What part? Samuel looked at Daniel. Thomas didn't disappear because he followed the boat. Daniel stared at him. Then why did he disappear? Samuel pointed toward the bell on the ground. He disappeared because he rang the bell. Daniel felt a chill. But I didn't ring it. Samuel looked at him. I know. Then he pointed toward the lake. Someone else rang it for you. Daniel slowly turned around. The lake was completely still. But in the middle of the water, a boat was appearing. Slowly, as if it were rising from beneath the surface. And inside the boat was the man. He was holding the bell. Daniel couldn't see his face, but this time, the man was smiling. Samuel grabbed Daniel's arm. Run! They ran toward the house. Behind them, the bell rang. Ding! They reached the door. Samuel pushed Daniel inside. Lock it! Daniel locked the door. Samuel closed the curtains. Then they stood together in silence. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, knock, knock, knock. Someone was standing outside. Daniel looked at Samuel. Samuel shook his head. Don't open it. The knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. Then a voice spoke. Samuel! Samuel's face changed. Daniel looked at him. You know that voice. Samuel didn't answer. The voice came again. Samuel. Samuel closed his eyes. Daniel whispered, Who is it? Samuel finally spoke. "My brother." Daniel stared at him. "But you said your family didn't live here." "They don't." "Is he alive?" Samuel shook his head. "No." The room became silent. Then the voice outside whispered, "Samuel." "Come outside." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. Daniel understood. Whatever was outside wasn't simply trying to scare them. It knew their memories. It knew their names. It knew exactly what to say, and it was waiting for one of them to open the door. Samuel looked at Daniel. "We have to leave." Daniel nodded. They moved toward the front door. Then they heard the bell. Ding! The lights in the house went out. Everything became black. Daniel grabbed Samuel's arm. "Stay with me." "I'm here." They slowly moved toward the door. Then they heard something behind them. A wet footstep. Step. Another. Step. Someone was walking through the house. Daniel turned on his phone flashlight. The hallway was empty, but the wet footprints were there. They were coming toward them. Step, step, step. Daniel and Samuel moved faster. They reached the front door. Samuel opened it. They ran outside. The night air was cold. They didn't stop running until they reached the road. Daniel turned around. The little house stood quietly beside the lake. The lights were off. The windows were dark. Everything looked normal. Then, from inside the house, ding! Daniel looked at Samuel. Samuel was staring at the house. His face was completely white. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Samuel didn't answer. "Samuel," finally he whispered, "the bell has never rung inside the house before." Daniel looked at the dark windows. "What does that mean?" Samuel took a deep breath. "It means..." He paused. "The house isn't empty anymore." Daniel looked toward the lake. The boat was gone. But across the water, one small light remained. And beneath the light, Daniel could see a person standing on the shore. The person slowly raised a hand. Daniel couldn't see the face, but he knew exactly who it was. Thomas, the man who had disappeared 20 years ago. Then the light went out, and the lake became dark, very dark. Samuel grabbed Daniel's shoulder. "We need to find Thomas's journal." Daniel looked at him. "Why?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "Because the answer is in the last page." Daniel remembered the notebook. He had stopped reading before the end. He looked back at the house. The door was still open. The wind moved through the trees, and somewhere inside the darkness, the little brass bell rang one more time. Ding.